Hi, glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. Have a good view. From El Agheila to Tobruk, a 1,000-mile march. At the beginning of 1941 in the North African theater of military operations, the situation stabilized. Weakness and low morale of the Italian troops were compensated by the decision of the Allies to reduce their grouping in Libya and to intensify combat operations on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, in Greece. At the end of February, 100,000 experienced and well-armed soldiers were sent there from North Africa. In Libya remained poorly trained 2nd Armored Division and the recently arrived 9th Australian Division, in Egypt the 6th Infantry Division, and the Polish Carpathian Brigade were being formed. Fighting in North Africa had virtually ceased, and Allied commanders did not anticipate enemy activity in that theater in the near future. However, while the British soldiers crossed from Africa to Greece to help the defeated and demoralized Italian troops in Libya, began redeployment of the African Corps under the command of Erwin Rommel. In late March, having waited for the concentration of the main forces of the 5th Light Division in Tripolitania, supported by infantry Italian units, Rommel suddenly attacked the British at El Agheila. Virtually meeting no resistance, on the shoulders of scattered Allied formations, Rommel's corps moved forward so fast that orders from his immediate superior, the commander of Italian forces in Libya, Italo Garibaldi, were always late. Without a fight having taken Benghazi and captured in the city of Derna up to 3,000 enemy soldiers and 6 generals, led by the military governor of Cyrenaica Felipe Nim, April 10th, Rommel's units approached Tobruk. This 2-week rush by Rommel from El Agheila to Tobruk shocked and discouraged the Allied command and their troops in Libya. For about 1,000 miles, the African Corps units marched at such a pace that the Germans' advanced motorized groups could not keep up with the retreating troops and constantly lost contact with them. Trial attack. Rommel's small forces, whose task was to stabilize the front and prevent a complete defeat of Italian units, turned into a panicked retreat of the Allies. The German general received the honorable nickname the Fox of the Desert, without having fought a single major battle in Libya. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called him a great commander, and General Claude Auchinleck, Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East Forces, wrote, "There is a real danger that our friend Rommel will become a sorcerer and a boogeyman to our soldiers. Even if he were superhuman, it would be highly undesirable for our soldiers to believe in his supernatural power. It seems important not to mention Rommel's name when we speak of the enemy in Libya. Psychologically, this is a matter of the highest importance." Undoubtedly, Erwin Rommel was a talented commander, and the operation he carried out in early April 1941 deserves flattering epithets. The German general was extremely active, personally led the attack of small units. On his plane had time to fly around the marching in the desert columns and give orders to lieutenants on the front line. For 2 weeks, he turned into a father of soldiers for the troops in Libya, and even demoralized earlier. Italian divisions under his command showed discipline and fortitude. The speed and maneuver of Rommel's troops during this operation are admirable, but it should be noted that before Tobruk, troops of the African Corps did not meet adequate resistance and did not participate in serious fighting. Studying the fighting in Libya, held from late May to April 10th, it seems that the Allied troops and their generals were completely unprepared for military action and simply gave Rommel the territory up to Tobruk. However, at Tobruk, everything changed, and at the siege of the city, Fox of the Desert was unable to show his commanding talent. The first failures of Rommel. On the approaches to Tobruk, control of Tobruk was of the utmost importance to both belligerents. It was the only major port on the 1,500 kilometers of the Libyan coast from Tunisia to Egypt. In the rugged desert, possession of Tobruk effectively meant possession of Libya. After the capture of the city, Rommel nothing would not prevent the victorious entry into Alexandria, Cairo, and close the most important sea route, the Suez Canal, for Allied ships. Rommel was inspired by the success of the last few days and believed as easily, with a move, to take Tobruk. But exhausted troops of the African Corps on the outskirts of the city bogged down in clashes with the barriers of the 9th Australian Division and moved forward is not as fast as desired Desert Fox. Rommel, dissatisfied with the actions of the commander of the 5th Light Division, Lieutenant General Streich, instructed to take the city, recently arrived commander of the 15th Armored Division, Major General Heinrich von Prittwitz, on Gafonu, the 15th Division itself, at this time only transferred to Libya by sea. But even Prittwitz failed to accelerate the drive on Tobruk. When Rommel, at the senior officers, arranged Major General Raznosti, he jumped into the staff car and left for the front line, where he was killed by shelling. The commander of the 200th Regiment, Colonel Gerhard von Schwerin, later recalled, "Oitsini Goras." I informed him, Rommel, that the general, whom he had just sent to raise the front, is already dead. I saw for the first time that Rommel was confused. He turned pale, turned on his heels, and walked out without saying a word. April 11th. Desert Fox still took Tobruk in the ring. The forces of the Italian Infantry Division Brescia Rommel planned to make a diversionary strike from the west, and the task of taking the city assigned to the tanks of his 5th Division, which was to attack from the east, from the road to Cairo. Believing the garrison of Tobruk weak and demoralized, Rommel worried that had to waste time on redeployment of units and preparations for the assault, but was now confident of victory. Since the most capable units from Libya were sent to the defense of Greece, Tobruk defended poorly trained, untrained 9th Australian Infantry Division under the command of recently promoted from Colonel to Brigadier Leslie Morshid. Morshid was ordered to hold out for 2 months, and despite the poor training of parts of his 9th Division, was determined. There was a large amount of military equipment, food, and ammunition in the city that should not fall into the hands of the Germans, and most importantly, every soldier realized that the surrender of the city could lead to the collapse of the entire North African front and the loss of Suez. 2 brigades Morshid left in Tobruk, and 2 more occupied the fortification, which was built by the Italians a year before the outbreak of war, and from where they were knocked out by the Allies during Operation Compass. The Tobruk fortification consisted of a 48-kilometer defensive line with lines of communication built on high ground. The 170 well-camouflaged bunkers that blended into the landscape were covered by 1.5-meter concrete walls, minefields, barbed wire, and anti-tank ditches. In addition to reliable fortifications, the defenders of Tobruk had another serious advantage over Rommel's troops. The African Corps was supplied through the port of Tripoli, 1,000 kilometers away, and the garrison had at the side of the military warehouses designed for all Libyan troops of the Allies. In addition, Morshid could receive supplies from Alexandria by sea. The German Air Force in this part of the Mediterranean was weak, and their bomber aircraft did not have enough strength either to destroy Allied convoys or to destabilize the port of Tobruk. First assault on Tobruk, sacrifice of the 8th Battalion. On April 11th, the assault on Tobruk began. Oberstleutnant Ponath's 8th Motorized Machine Gun Battalion was brought to the cutting edge of the attack. Following the armor of 20 tanks of the 5th Regiment, the infantry approached the Tobruk defense line. But just before the trenches, the tanks ran into anti-tank ditches and turned back. The defenseless 8th Battalion came under hurricane artillery fire and began to quickly entrench. At this point, Rommel stopped the attack, and Ponath's soldiers left for the night in the shelters they had dug. The next day, to the anti-tank ditches were sent sappers, but a strong sandstorm played out, and, suffering losses from Australian fire, the sappers retreated. In the evening, another attempt at a tank breakthrough was made. Again, the 5th Tank Regiment Oberst Ulbricht tried to maneuver along the fortification line and by feel to find gaps in the enemy defenses, but suffered heavy losses and was forced to withdraw. The commander of the 5th Division, General Streich, wanted to dissuade Rommel from further attacks. He insisted on intelligence gathering and careful planning. Desert Fox did not hear the subordinate and left the battalion Ponath another night in the trenches under the fierce artillery guns Tobruk. By the evening of April 13th, Rommel ordered the 8th Battalion to once again attack the Australian positions. The Italian artillery had previously conducted an artillery preparation and made gaps in the barbed wire fences. Soldiers Ponat completed the task, passed the line of defense of the Australians, and strengthened. But it began to dusk, and Rommel, fearing ambushes, did not dare to send in the breakthrough tanks. With dawn, Olbricht's regiment moved into the gap, but it turned out that the German infantry, waiting for reinforcements, went behind the line of Australian trenches, leaving it to the second wave of the offensive. And at night, Morshida soldiers returned to their trenches without a fight. The tanks of the 5th Regiment met with a barrage of fire, and Olbricht hastily retreated. Ponat's battalion found itself surrounded. The following evening, scattered groups of infantry still managed to fight their way back. Of the battalion returned only 116 people. The remaining 500, along with the commander, did not survive these 4 days of constant assault. Half of the 5th Regiment's tanks were destroyed, and the other half damaged. It was a complete failure. So thought all the German generals, but not Rommel. He ordered the 5th Division to attack the Tobruk fortifications again, but the general's patience was breaking, and in response, the Desert Fox received direct disobedience to his orders. Streich was supported by Olbricht and the commander of the 200th Regiment Schwerin. They refused to attack blindly, without reconnaissance, and rebuked their commander for being willing to sacrifice excellent soldiers instead of taking the time to prepare for the assault. As a result of his rash and hasty actions at Tobruk, Rommel found in the face of the highest officers of the African Corps strong and consolidated opposition. Furious debate ended for the Fox of the Desert nothing. He could not force the generals to accept his will and continue the attack on Tobruk. Rommel laid the blame for the death of Ponat's battalion on Streich and Olbricht, accused them of disobeying orders and inept leadership of troops. Information about the failure of the storming of the city and sabotage generals. Rommel's orders quickly reached Berlin, Chief of General Staff of the Army. Franz Galder reflected these events in his diary. "I have a feeling that there is a complete confusion. Reports of officers coming from the theater, as well as private letters, say that Rommel is completely unsuitable for the task before him. He all day long swings between the scattered at a great distance troops, wasted on the trifles of his strength." To cool this mad soldier, Halder sent to Africa his deputy, Major General Friedrich von Paulus. By the end of April, the African Corps received reinforcements. To the place of fighting arrived 15th Panzer Division, the commander of which, after the death near Tobruk, Prittwitz, was appointed Major General Hans Karl von Esebeck. In addition, the Italians finally found a plan for the fortifications of Tobruk, which they themselves had built shortly before the war. The second assault was decided to start not from the road to Cairo, but from the plain to the southwest. The attackers were divided into 2 groups. The first, which consisted of parts of the 5th Division, was commanded by Major General Kirchheim, a senior officer of the General Staff, who was on an inspection tour in Libya. The second group under von Esebeck included the newly arrived 15th Division. After an intensified artillery preparation, in the evening of April 30th, the attack on the city began. German troops rushed to Height 209. By the next morning, the advanced Australian pillboxes were taken, but the attackers were stopped by well-camouflaged fortifications of the second line of defense. The German units began to suffer heavy losses, and by evening, a sandstorm played out. Seeing the senselessness of further advancement in this area, Paulus proposed to stop the assault, but Rommel insisted on continuing the attack. Several days Rommel kept his troops under constant artillery. Dagger fire pillboxes interspersed with fierce counterattacks Morshida Division. Despite the persistence of the Desert Fox and heavy losses, the German troops could not advance further. Von Esebeck wrote about these days. The summer heat hit the positions with all its brutal force. Mirages of lakes of clear water were observed on the heights. Millions of flies made life unbearable. Artillery fire, attacks by assault groups, tank raids, machine gun fire, and bombs from airplanes all followed one after another. There was not a moment's respite. The African Corps was in a difficult position, also because ammunition and food were running low. The Corps was supplied from Tripoli, a port 1,000 miles away. At sea dominated the British, but even those convoys that managed to avoid meeting with the Allied ships could not provide Rommel all necessary. The maximum capacity of the port of Tripoli was 45,000 tons per month, and the Germans and Italians needed 116,000 tons. Soldiers began to give the food that was still available in military warehouses, mainly canned food. Rommel's men were suffering from scurvy and stomach infections. Maximilian von Herf, commander of the 115th Infantry Regiment, recalled that after 3 days of illness, he was so weak that in one day he fainted 3 times. Both soldiers and officers could not wait for the end of this company. They said to themselves, "No more going to Africa." Following the combat failures and illnesses, morale in the troops began to plummet. No one from the rank and file to Paulus did not understand the stubbornness of Rommel, who continues to storm Tobruk despite the obvious lack of prospects and serious losses. To change the situation of troops in Libya, Paulus urgently flew to Berlin and May 11th had a lengthy conversation with Galder. After this meeting, the Chief of General Staff made a note in his diary. "There is a very bad situation. Rommel has absolutely no sense of proportion. For this task, he is not suitable." What reported Paulus to his boss, it is unknown, but returning home from the General Staff, he said in extremely harsh terms about this stupid, short-sighted Schwab, which creates an image at the expense of correspondents, photographers, and cameramen of all stripes. After the failure of the second assault, Tobruk came a long pause. Rommel moved to besiege the city. The Allies were also exhausted, exsanguinated, and could not begin active actions. But the generals of the opposing sides in different ways used the time given to them. In July 1941, Churchill appointed General Claude Auchinleck as commander-in-chief in the Middle East, who immediately stated that without serious preparation of the offensive in North Africa cannot begin. To the displeasure of the Prime Minister, who hoped to resume hostilities in Africa while the Germans are busy on the Eastern Front, Auchinleck, flying to London, insisted on postponing the active phase of hostilities in November. From early summer, British convoys took a long but safe route around Africa and through the Suez Canal. There was a railroad line almost to the Egyptian border with Libya. A water pipeline was laid from Alexandria. In Western Egypt, concentrated equipment established supply lines, replenished warehouses of weapons, food, and ammunition, prepared and trained troops. By the end of September, under the command of the commander of the 8th Army, General Alan Cunningham was concentrated about 6 divisions and 720 tanks. Rommel, at this time, shared power with the commander-in-chief of the Italian Armed Forces in Africa, Field Marshal Ettore Bastico. July 28th, Desert Fox flew to the Reich to meet with Hitler and then went to Mussolini. Rommel was able to convince the leaders of the Axis countries to re-subordinate part of the Italian troops in North Africa. Despite the terrible conditions the troops were facing at Tobruk and the lack of supplies, the German and Italian leaders agreed not to lift the siege of the city. In order to avoid being stabbed in the back in the upcoming third assault on Tobruk, Rommel plotted a raid on the Allied rear. He was going to capture or destroy large ammunition depots 20 kilometers from the Libyan border. Operation Midsummer Night's Dream was entrusted to the 21st Armored Division and led by Rommel himself. On September 14th, 3 columns of tanks and empty trucks for the removal of trophies moved across the border. During the march, the Germans, to their surprise, did not meet any resistance, and arriving at the site, did not find the warehouses. German tanks combed the desert for a long time until the British Air Force arrived. Having lost in the bombardment of 2 gas tankers with precious fuel and 2 tanks, Rommel ordered a withdrawal. He was very upset, but here on his luck, in the British wrecked car, soldiers found a very important document, the battle plan of the 8th Army. The document was disinformation planted by Allied intelligence, and from it was clear that the British are not ready for the offensive and do not intend to hold it. Upon his return, Rommel immediately assembled his staff and demonstrated the Allied plans. "Our sortie on the 14th, he said, gave us one thing. The enemy has no intention of advancing. This means that no offensive is expected in the coming weeks or months. No longer worried about the rear of his area, Rommel once again pressed in Berlin and Rome, and on October 11th announced the beginning of preparations for Operation Michael to capture Tobruk. Field Marshal Bastico and many Italian generals were not in agreement with this decision. They pointed to the weakness of the positions of the attackers, poor supply, and most importantly, the risk of a blow to the rear of the troops storming the city. But Rommel had an invincible argument: the plan of action of the 8th Army Cunningham. Reports of German and Italian intelligence on the activity on the border and the concentration of Allied troops, Rommel did not want to listen to. Photos of air reconnaissance ignored. One of his subordinates, Major General Max Zimmermann, he even forbade to further conduct reconnaissance operations. In early November, Rommel defiantly flew out of Africa to meet with his family on his birthday. Returned to the troops' Desert Fox on November 18th, just the day when the offensive Operation Crusader began, as a result of which the siege of Tobruk was lifted. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. See you soon.